Welcome everyone to the panel on the scope and scale of online intimidation. I apologize for the delay. We were sorting out some technical problems. My name is Julia Wright, and I'm George Monroe Chair of Literature and Rhetoric at Dalhousie University, located in the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm grateful to be speaking to you from Mi'kmaqi and ask you all to take a moment to consider our histories and our lands as the grounds of our obligations to each other. Digital environments may distract us from, but cannot erase, our lived and shared existence in time and space. Our plan for this session is to hear from the three speakers and then have some initial discussion between the panelists and then open things up to questions and comments from the audience. Please feel free to drop your thoughts into the Q&A option on your screens. It's my understanding these questions will not be public, but will only be seen by those of us on the virtual stage. First, I want to give you some context, though. This panel comes out of the Royal Society of Canada's COVID-19 Task Force. The task force has been active for a year and a half now and has overseen about 30 working groups developing policy briefings to support us all through and beyond the pandemic. Part of the task force's work has been thinking about ways of improving how we share expertise and research. The Working Group on Representations of Science produced its briefing last year, dealing with issues connected to effective science communications. A second working group on protecting public advice is now expanding that discussion to consider the safety concerns arising from a culture of intimidation and threats against experts of all disciplines, not just the sciences. Anti-vaccine disinformation, for instance, doesn't just circulate false science. History has also been abused to misrepresent vaccination efforts as persecution. Disinformation campaigns designed to target particular populations for harassment and threats go back to the 6th century and the reign of Justinian. In our time, violent discourse online was used against scholars working in areas from equity to climate science long before the COVID-19 pandemic. The working group's central concern is measures that will help prevent researchers from being chased out of the public square by a few loud voices, so that the public has continuing robust access to the extensively checked knowledge generated across our public institutions. Today's panel comes out of these discussions. I'll introduce all three panelists now to whet your appetites, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. First up is Anatoly Grush. He is Canada Research Chair in Privacy Preserving Digital Technologies, a professor at the Ted Rogers School of Information Technology Management, and the Director of Research at the Social Media Lab at Ryerson University. Our second speaker is Timothy Caulfield. He is a Canada Research Chair in Health Law and Policy at the University of Alberta. His research focuses on health and science policy on a range of topics, including stem cell research, genetics, public health, vaccination, and public representations of science and health issues. Our final speaker is Wendy Hui Jung-Chun. She is a Canada 150 Research Chair in New Media at Simon Fraser University. She is the author of several works, including Discriminating Data and Updating to Remain the Same, Habitual New Media. She has held significant roles at Brown University, the Annenberg School in Princeton, and fellowships from the Guggenheim, ACLS, American Academy of Berlin, and Harvard. Now, without further ado, over to Professor Grush.
Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here and open our panel discussion. And if we can start my slide deck, that would be great. Just to confirm that you can see my slides. Good to go? Yes, excellent. So the work I'm going to present today is coming out from our research at the Social Media Lab. We are part of the Ted Rogers School of Management here in Toronto, and we study how people and organizations use social media for communication purposes, information sharing, and sometimes for disinformation sharing. And we're trying to understand those practices, patterns behind the usage and adoption trends. But today I want to take us back to 2008. This is when a relatively unknown first-term US Senator from the state of Illinois, Barack Obama, won his first US presidency. The success of Obama's team can largely be attributed to the effective use of social media, which essentially allowed them to share information quickly, reach many of their supporters. And so what is interesting that after that successful campaign, our politicians here in Canada also started using social media more actively. So much so that the Globe and Mail declared the 2011 federal election as Canada's first social media election. But a few years later, interestingly, in 2016, in his farewell speech, President Obama came out expressing concerns about social media being a threat to democracy. And this is especially interesting coming from a president who will go down in history as the first social media president with his own social media archive. Well, at the same time, his sentiment is understandable. And there is a lot of ambivalence about social media today. When we see its role in popular political uprisings or charitable fundraising campaigns, we recognize it as a force for good. But when we see it's used to recruit terrorists, propagate racism, we condemn it as a malicious and harmful tool. And if we think about the 2016 US presidential election and the UK's Brexit referendum, this was one of the first time that was well documented how the power of social media to serve as a medium for good and bad was on full display. And this is when various actors weaponized social media and they spread mis and disinformation in an attempt to influence people's votes and undermine democratic processes in those countries. So in our own research, we're trying to kind of deconstruct and understand what actually happened during this type of events, so we can understand better patterns behind inauthentic behavior on social media and various coordinated attacks on other individuals online. And so to demonstrate that, I'm just going to show you quickly a case study. I only have about 5 minutes or so, but I thought it would be interesting for you to see how a particular campaign coordinated efforts to interfere in certain elections happened on Twitter in particular. Why? Because we need to understand the strategy to understand how we can combat those type of things in the future. So the example is from the 2016 US presidential election, and the election interference campaign was organized by a Russian internet research agency. How do we know that? Well, Twitter actually released a massive data set of about 9 million tweets and retweets by about 4,000 accounts that they determined to be associated with this internet agency, essentially a troll farm. And what is interesting that the activities actually, the documented activities on the platform on Twitter lasted for about 80 years. Today, I just want to zoom in and focus on the 30 days before the 2016 US presidential election, just to highlight some of the trends here. And but before I do that, essentially to understand this type of campaigns, it's quite useful to take this network approach. Or network analysis approach. And I will show you some network visualizations, but before I do that, I want to quickly introduce some of the key concepts so that it's easier for you to relate what you see on the screen. So first, to analyze any kinds of data sets, and such as the one that coming from social media as a network, we need to represent some data points as actor nodes. And for Twitter data sets, actor nodes in the network will be accounts, individual, organizational, bots, trolls, and so on. Then we need to connect the accounts based on observed interactions. And for Twitter, if we study communication patterns, we often connect actor nodes based on who retweets, replies, or mentions whom, depends on research questions. And then if we observe the interactions over time, we can then assign a weight, how strongly a particular node connected. To demonstrate that, I'll show you how we can turn one tweet in a network representation. And then we will jump into the case to look at the Internet Research Agency behavior on Twitter. So let's look at this tweet from Donald Trump. This is when his account was still active. Since then, of course, it was suspended. But when it was active, at Real Donald Trump, that's his account, tweeted it, it was a great honor to meet, to host Canadian Prime Minister at Justin Trudeau at the White House today, and 2 emojis. So if we're trying to represent this data as a network, we can recognize there are 3 actors involved. Those are Twitter accounts, Real Donald Trump, at Justin Trudeau, and at White House. But the interaction is coming from at Real Donald Trump account. So the connections will be going from that node, actor node as well, to Justin Trudeau, who is mentioned in this tweet, as well as at White House as an individual entity here. So now we usually apply this, this pattern, this transformation to all of the millions of tweets that you might have in your data set to build this beautiful but also very informative network visualizations. And that's what I'm going to use to demonstrate the different types of attacks and different types of strategies that this troll factory used during the 2016 US election. So you see there are dots here in this visualization, very small ones because there are so many of them. But to differentiate between regular accounts and those that were associated with Internet Research Agency account, I used different color nodes here. So the red dots represent those accounts that are associated with IRA, Internet Research Agency, and the green dots are all other accounts that were engaged in the conversations. And so what we're going to do quickly in the last couple of minutes of my introductory remarks, I'm just going to highlight some of the clusters that they form, because those are informative strategies that this particular campaign used. So this is just an example of an account that currently suspended, but it was part of this coordinated attempt to interfere in the election, and it was called @10GOP, an official Twitter of Tennessee's Republicans. So it was actually a fake account, but at the time it was active. It actually had 145,000 followers. So just to imagine, to show their influence at the time they started to launch this campaign. So the main cluster here, I'm zooming in here, shows a lot of red dots, and they tried to engage the green dots here, mostly by sharing and reposting in pro-Trump and anti-Hillary content. And that's something you would expect from the campaign that supports a particular candidate. But then when we go to the second largest cluster, and when we examine some of the interactions and the reshares within that cluster, most of the content and accounts engaged were from the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was quite interesting for us, something that we don't usually expect. And essentially, it reveals this complex nature of their strategy when bots and trolls are not just supporting a particular candidate, but they're also trying to discredit their opponents. And they're using different group of accounts. We also can see that to promote activism in opposition to their primary candidate, which in this case was Trump. And it's likely because they want to build incite polarization in the society and build incivility in the democratic society. So as they say, if people busy, organization busy fighting with each other, they don't really pay any attention to what's happening around them. So again, the unique feature of this campaign that the trolls and bots were engaging and promoting content on the both sides of the political spectrum in the US. So that was a novel aspect here. What wasn't as much novel is this cluster. We label it as a sports and entertainment cluster. This is part of a more traditional bait and switch type of campaign where you start following some engaging accounts that post funny and entertaining Twitter messages in this case. But then at the time, once those accounts gain enough followers, so gain virtual credibility, they then switch their content and start posting certain content to push certain agendas, in this case, political related agenda. And what it all comes down to, there's one central account that links all different clusters here, and it's a YouTube account. It's a Twitter account for YouTube network. What it tells us that many links and many content pieces shared through this campaign link people outside of Twitter network. It just shows you that this type of campaigns tend to be multi-platform campaigns. What starts as a simple text-based tweet can then be formed into the visually appealing Instagram photo and then turn into the video and shared on YouTube. So that highlights some of also challenges to combat some of these campaigns. So I'll stop here, and just again to reiterate, this is just one example of coordinated efforts to incite incivility and polarization in a democratic society. And I look forward to hearing from Tim and Wendy about some of their experiences and research in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatoly. Over to you, Tim.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. It's a real honor to be here. Hello from Edmonton, Alberta, Treaty 6. I'm going to be talking about the infodemic. And we really are in the middle of an infodemic, as this group knows. And this infodemic is doing tremendous harm. We also know from a growing body of research that this is largely, not entirely, but largely a social media phenomenon. Yes, the misinformation is coming from friends and neighbors. It's coming from the conventional press. But I think we have a pretty robust body of evidence that tells us this is largely a social media phenomenon. And that's really important, right? Because that tells us where we need to go to fight the infodemic. This was an interesting study that came out, 85%, that came out, I think it was late August, early September, actually from the University of Alberta. And this researcher actually tried to put a number on it, tried to find sort of the origin story for each bit of misinformation about the infodemic, and calculated about 85% of it, started on social media. Now, we also know there's a growing body of evidence to support this, that if you get your information from social media, from Twitter, from Facebook, from Instagram, from TikTok, you are more likely to believe misinformation, more likely to spread misinformation. Yes, it's hard to study it well, correlation, causation, but I think we've come at this from enough methodological directions that we know that that is true. We also know it's getting worse, at least in the context of volume, right? Just in the context of volume. This was an interesting analysis that came out in August after the big Delta wave, and found that misinformation about the idea that the vaccines don't work up over 430%, right? It's crazy out there. It's crazy out there. And what's also interesting is I think a growing group of individuals, the growing body of the public recognize the degree to which this is a problem. So this was an analysis in the United States that found that 95% of Americans believe that the spread of misinformation is a serious social policy concern. A similar study here in Canada put it at 96% of Canadians admitting that they see misinformation kind of on the daily. Another very interesting study came out again, I'm going to say just weeks ago, found that 8 in 10 Americans believe one of the big conspiracy theories. Again, hard to study this well. Surveys have their inherent flaws, but there's been enough data on this to tell us that we know that misinformation is doing real harm, and people are believing pretty extreme stuff. The Bill Gates conspiracy theory, a hardcore conspiracy theory, a surprising sector of society embraces that idea. And as I said at the beginning, we know this is doing real harm. It's not hyperbole to say that misinformation is killing people. It's killing people. It's distorting. It is distorting our public discourse. This is a real problem. And as a result of that, a growing body of institutions, the World Health Organization, the CDC, the NIH, the CIHR, the Public Health Agency of Canada, on and on and on, are calling for people, calling for experts to get on social media and fight this infodemic. And I agree. I absolutely agree. We need more voices. We need more diverse voices. We need voices from a variety of communities to step up, to become part of the Go Science team and fight misinformation. And the good news is, yes, it's complex, but in the aggregate, if you do it well, debunking does work. I know that's not a great term. It sounds combative. It sounds kind of unilateral, but that's the term of art that's emerged. And, debunking does work. Countering misinformation really can have an impact. But we also know that it's not easy. If you are out there countering misinformation, if you're out there trying to engage the public, if you're an expert, it can be tough. And we have research to back that up. This was a study that came out just last month, found that those individuals who are out there fighting misinformation are constantly abused, right? They get threats. 15% of them said they get death threats. Death threats. This is a piece in Nature. Many more have faced abusive behavior. Another study from prominent science communicators published in BMJ earlier this year, 91% of them have faced abusive behavior, and it is worse for women and people of color. The abuse is terrible. And I know it, I've experienced it myself. I received death threats. I'm in the middle of a lawsuit. People lie about me online. And all of this is done to silence us, right? To chill the public discourse. And unfortunately, we also know that these strategies can work. Even if they just cause you to second guess your actions, these people are being successful. So this matters. So what we need to do, and really why we're here today, is to talk about how we can support individuals from a wide range of communities to get online and help push back against the noise, and also really just to keep that civil public discourse happening. How can we do that? Not an easy question in a liberal democracy. Not an easy question of, when you're talking about private actors like the social media platforms, but we've got to figure this out. We've got to figure out how institutions, universities, governments, provincial governments, research centers, how we can support and encourage more diverse voices to become part of the Go Science team. And I'm going to end, Julia, with one shout out for our initiative, #ScienceUpFirst. This is our effort to put out positive content, to fight misinformation. Come be part of the team. All you've got to do is join us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. If you want to dance, on TikTok, come be part of the Science Up First team, because this is exactly what we're trying to do. Use positive, science-informed content to make a difference. So I'll stop there, Julia. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation.
Thank you, Tim. Over to you, Wendy.
Hello, everybody from Vancouver and the unceded Coast Salish nations. So I'm the problem child. This is why we were late. So my tech, my executable files aren't working. So I'm going to do a little bit of performance art as well and sort of describe these visuals, and we're going to imagine them as we go along. So thank you, Julia, for inviting me and putting me on this fabulous panel to address the scope and scale of online intimidation. And I just wanted to remind us of the questions that Julia posed to us today. Namely, are social media company algorithms and mechanisms that seek to weed out such content sufficient to address intimidation and disinformation campaigns? And what are the cultural, social, and political implications of corporate managed social media becoming a major channel for public education and influencing even the tone of public debate? Now, clearly, this will take much longer than our time together to answer, but following from Anatoly and Tim's excellent comments, I'll use my 5 to 7 minutes to draw out what's really the uneven impact of online intimidation. Because what's clear is that all researchers, as Tim noted, aren't equally targeted. And as many studies and reports have shown, and you have to imagine that right now you're seeing a section from the AAUP report, researchers who address certain topics such as global climate change and racial justice, and now of course vaccines, this is what the AAUP calls academic danger zones. And they call them danger zones because these topics, they argue, threaten entrenched interests or partisan ideologues. Researchers who address these issues are most frequently attacked. But importantly, it's not just topic that matters. So as a recent 2021 study by Chandal Goss and her colleagues have shown, and they surveyed 182 scholars and academics who experienced online harassment in 2020, what they showed was that online harassment is heavily entwined with, quote, the work, identity, and in some cases, the requirements of being a scholar. The online harassment scholars experience is often compounded by other factors such as gender and physical appearance. So most simply, women, people of color, LGBTQ+ researchers are often targeted not just because of what they study, but who they are. And most importantly, they're also attacked at this level. So there are many, in terms of gender, there'll be threats of rape, etc. So the types of the abuse they receive are personal, and they explicitly reference their race and gender. Now, what's key is that this abuse, however personal, stems from the required actions as scholars, from knowledge mobilization, such as posting about their research on social media or having other people post about their research on social media. It stems from their teaching. It also stems from activities such as writing on op-eds, etc. So they're being attacked for doing their job, for addressing questions of disinformation, discrimination, and addressing issues of public health. So in essence, and again, focusing on questions of EDI, if we think of the ubiquitous EDI initiatives right now within Canadian and US universities, we're putting these people on the front lines. We're asking them to take on the hard issues. We're asking them to take on issues of systemic bias, redress historical inequalities, support equity-seeking groups, knowing that this makes them vulnerable to attack. And this puts everything and everyone at risk, because the impacts, as this and many other studies have shown, and this is what Tim referenced earlier, these impacts are serious. They can lead to withdrawal and silence. They can lead to a fundamental questioning of themselves as researchers and teachers. And what's important about Goss's study is that a large number of her survey participants were MA and PhD students who were just starting out in their careers and without as much institutional support as tenured professors. But we also, as we take this on, have to remember that this problem, like these issues, and this is something that Anatoly pointed out, go beyond academia. So in a recent study that we did in the Digital Democracies Institute, we found that Muslim Canadian politicians came under fire disproportionate to their rank, because clearly highly ranked politicians usually come under higher fire, when they directly addressed issues of Islamophobia. Other studies have shown that 1 in 4 Black Americans have experienced online harassment. Okay, so if this is so, what can we do? And again, the question that was posed to us was, can online solutions such as content moderation make this go away? In a word, no. And one reason why it can't is that online, these folks are doubly targeted. So content moderation routinely censors those who take on questions of racism. And you'd see here, imagine, a bunch of reports and stories about the ways in which Black English, for instance, is regularly targeted, as well as activists who take on questions of racism are regularly censored. A colleague of mine, Kate McKinney, is looking at the ways in which the first group censored online were AIDS activists. And much recent work in natural language processing has focused on understanding biases embedded within language models. And this is in part because the ground truth of a lot of these models is Wikipedia. But what's so important to understand about why these are being taken down is, again, an orchestrated effort where people are manipulating and taking advantage of flagging mechanisms to attack activists. So no online solution to this, especially in terms of researchers, is enough, because the cultural, social, and political implications of corporate managed social media becoming a major channel for public education and influencing even the tone of public debate move beyond social media. And what makes these attacks so harmful is they intersect with the classroom and with the profession. And imagine you're seeing here a taxonomy that was recently produced by Grimes in 2020, outlining the ways in which various health communicators have been attacked. And what's so key about this is that social media is just one edge of the circle. And what's also there are nuisance complaints that go to the profession, nuisance complaints to institutions, et cetera, and they're all intertwined. But what that means is that where we can intervene, and indeed where we need to intervene, is within that larger circle. And what's key as well is that we need to do this in order to enable critical public dialogue and questioning, for better research and democratic dialogue to emerge. Because what I want to stress is that what's so problematic about social media becoming a major channel for public education and public dialogue isn't that it makes people challenge or question authorities. Questioning is central to education, to research, to democracy. What's harmful is when questioning and curiosity lead to trusting even more dubious sources. So when questioning CNN leads to trusting Breitbart, or questioning mRNA vaccine leads to trusting ivermectin. And I think we need to think through this larger critical space and think through ways of both taking on these questions of online intimidation and using it as an opportunity to expand the joy, the curiosity, and the questioning that's part of research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So now we have some time for our three panelists to talk amongst themselves. So who wants to go first? Any questions or comments?
I can jump in.
Thank you.
I just want to build on what Wendy, you presented. I think the way you framed it was very well done. And the challenges, we know about the challenges of content moderation, and it's not one solution that will fix everything. As you describe, let's call them bad actors. They find a way to bypass those type of moderation techniques by either maybe using certain keywords that filtering systems will not pick up, or using other techniques. So it's kind of whack-a-mole game. So certainly the platforms have to be constantly improving the techniques to catch them. And then you outline another issue that it may also catch and identify false positive posts from legitimate actors. So those are issues. I don't necessarily think that we should abandon the content moderation, either automated or manual approaches, but I think what we want to look at how this type of content moderation policies are developed across different platforms and how they apply, because my sense is that it's not being applied evenly or equally across different platforms. What's allowed on one platform or what's blocked on one platform, those actors can simply move on to something else. And so that those leaves a lot of wiggle room for bad actors. The other issue, of course, is there is a process where other users, community members, can report and flag certain content. And that relates to both misinformation related content as well as the online harassment and intimidation campaigns. But quite often what we hear from surveys and other reporting from social media users that once they report something, they often don't get feedback, or get feedback only months and months after they report something. So platforms really need to reconsider their review process when it takes too long, and providing feedback to encourage actually legitimate users to contribute to some of the crowdsourcing efforts.
Thank you. Wendy or Tim?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that, and I absolutely agree that developing strategies that will encourage, which I think one of the points really important points that Wendy made, is developing strategies that facilitate ongoing dialogue and facilitate this curiosity-driven exploration of content is going to be a real challenge, because you want to encourage that, but at the same time you want to stop exactly the intimidation that we're talking about in this presentation. And the other thing I think that that's been highlighted is the degree to which often what the trolls, let's call them that, or whether they're bots or real people, what they're trying to do is just create information chaos. That's the goal. And there's been some really interesting research, some of it very recent, that has highlighted that, in fact, that is the goal, right? Information chaos. And because of that, just creating noise is the goal. It can be very difficult to develop strategies to stop that, right? Because it isn't just, as I said in my presentation, about countering misinformation. It's kind of about trying to stop the noise, to allow a constructive conversation to move forward. And I think increasingly that's becoming the reality. We are seeing this phenomenal polarization of the discourse. Our own research has found this over the past year. You know, we looked at the hydroxychloroquine debate on Twitter. We looked at, you know, 1 million tweets, and it was all about politics, right? It was all about politics. It was all about ideology. It was not about the clinical trials and what the evidence actually said. Incredibly so. And because of that, because the intimidation and the harassment is so often embedded in those ideologies, in those camps, in that in-group sort of framing, I think that makes, you know, battling that intimidation and facing it even more challenging.
Thank you. Anyone else? Wendy?
Yeah, the points that have been raised are so important. And I think that one way we can think through this is as well, so first of all, we need to think of content moderation more broadly. I mean, a lot of people have shown that content moderation by social media platforms isn't simply when they take things down, but rather how they amplify things or not. You can think of the famous example of Tumblr, where they suddenly made queer content unfindable. There are different ways in which content is always being shaped and this chaos being managed. And I think if we have a larger view of that, that would also help us understand how we can intervene into it. And I think that taking seriously Tim's comment about this chaos being the point, and that perhaps the ongoing problem will be, given that this chaos will be there, how does one intervene into this ongoing global, as Anatoly has pointed out, system? What sort of content, what sort of tools are needed, and move it away perhaps from these global tools to focus on specific researchers and experiences of researchers, and to ask what would be useful for them. Again, thinking through the fact that it's not simply going to be at the level of social media. What often is most harmful for these researchers is what happens at the institution, what happens in the classroom, the ways in which the social media intersects with the classroom. And so thinking through that as a point of intervention and what that would look like, I think is absolutely key, and also moves us away from saying, well, you know, Facebook has to do something or Twitter has to do something, towards thinking what kind of moves we can do. And I also think that the really important point of polarization and the ways in which these algorithms are built on homophily, which is the idea that similarity breeds connection. So therefore, echo chambers aren't an unfortunate side effect, they're a goal. And trying to think beyond homophily and the dangers of homophily. So what's really strange to me is that homophily was presented and taken from the social sciences, imported into the computational sciences, because it was assumed that homophily makes people more comfortable. You're more comfortable with people around you. Well, not only the social science literature, not only does that call it into question, the Facebook whistleblowers testimony, which showed the more people were put into feeds with their family and people like them, the more agitated they became, is absolutely key to also thinking through the kinds of public discourse that moves across sectors that's important. And this is where I think intervention should happen at the level of social media platforms and algorithms, to move away from this debilitating sole focus on homophily, which homophily does work some of the time, but not all of the time, and trying to think through what these other relations, which are so important in our lives and in our research, what that would look like and how we can think through those.
Great, thank you. Anatoly?
Yeah, I want to follow up with the homophily notion. because this one is interesting and it's a bit contradictory too. Essentially, just like Wendy said, we do observe pockets of the political polarization or other forms of polarization that are created and enforced by the social media platforms, just the way their recommender systems work. We've done a lot of work on YouTube's recommender system in the context of anti-vaccination content. And we did notice that in many cases, once you start watching anti-vaccination type of videos, you've been recommended more likely of that same type. So this is, of course, problematic because when people are exposed to the same polarized content, their views may become more extreme and so on. But the opposite problem is true. Essentially, if we give up on the homophily idea and recommender type of systems, then what you have this open, perhaps public sphere, what many describe Twitter is, but maybe not, where you have a collision, different ideas essentially collide, and that meant to lead to a lot of conflicts. And so what it shows us right now, when we have a billion plus member social network platforms, they are not ready, not equipped to manage those type of diverse conversations where those collisions happens. So essentially, again, going back to improving the content moderation approaches, but also empowering individual users and making communities, community moderation possible as well, similar to some of the self-moderated groups on Reddit. And I think Twitter moving towards that design as well, and some other platforms look into that. Not perfect solution, but it's just one way to think about this problem.
Great, thank you. I'll remind our audience that if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please drop it into the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll wait for people to do that. I wonder if people want to talk a little bit about the larger economic context of this, because one of the reasons, and just to state the obvious, that people have moved on to social media is because it's free. We have cut back on libraries. Newspapers have become more expensive. Print newspapers are harder to find. Education has become more expensive. A lot of the traditional routes for information, including walking up to the help desk at the library and asking for a good source on something, a lot of that stuff has gone away. And Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and so on are partly popular because they are free. And I wonder what the panelists think about that, what we might call information poverty writ large, and that information from other sources, from non-social media sources, has gotten very expensive and prohibitively so. I wonder if anyone wants to comment on that.
I'll go first on that one, Julia. Look, social media, the internet, it's not going away. This is how information is going to be shared. This is, how people are going to get content. I got 4 kids. I don't think they could imagine doing what you just described, right? I don't think they could imagine it. It's just never going to happen. It's going back to the printing press, right? This is the world that we live in, and we have to be really careful. I think this is important. We have to be very careful not to be a technophobe, right? We've seen, throughout history, we've had these reactions to technologies, the printing press, people thought human beings couldn't handle all that information. Novels were too vivid. We should, especially for women, they shouldn't be they shouldn't be reading movies, radio, and on and on. So I think we need to be realistic. But what we can do, I think, is recognize the need to support the creation of good content online. Support the creation of good journalism. I once gave a talk with the terrific journalist Carly Weeks at the Globe and Mail, and someone asked her what should we do to fight misinformation, and she said her response was sign up for a newspaper, right? Subscribe to a newspaper and subscribe to quality newspapers from across the ideological spectrum, because we need to support the creation of good content. And I think that's true also. I think that's also true at the level of research institutions. And I think research institutions, universities, et cetera, are getting better and better at getting good content online. But bringing this back to the idea of intimidation and harassment, I think institutions also need to support those who are trying to get out there with good content, trying to engage on social media, and not just support them through their annual evaluations, but support them legally, saying we got your back. This is what will support if you get in trouble. And I hear that from colleagues who are fighting misinformation online. They feel alone, they feel scared, and that forces them to pull back. We need to develop strategies, as Wendy said, go to these individual researchers. Let's get on the ground, find out what we need to do to make sure that researchers across the world feel comfortable doing their job, right? Feel comfortable doing their job. And it's a job that's becoming increasingly important in this chaotic information environment.
Thank you. Wendy?
Yeah, I want to stress again that going to individual researchers like Tim who are doing this and ask them what they need and giving them the support they need is absolutely critical. But to move again to the question of economics, I think that one thing that needs to be taken on and thought through is the economic model of social media. Very famously in the Valley, people will say, that you're the product, not the buyer, right? Or Jerome Lanier has put it most subtly, and like I have a, regardless, Jerome I think has got down when he says that actually the product is a slight behavioral modification of the user. And when we think through clickbait and the sort of agitation that's required for clickbait or these triggers to work properly, that's what we need to think through because it's not free. It absolutely isn't free. And the ways in which the advertisements operate and what's being rewarded or not is precisely the problem. And if we had a larger scale of the economics and even an understanding of how this operates and could think through different economic models that would actually go to questions also of user data value, et cetera, and think through the incredible economics of the entire system, I think we could start moving towards understanding the different values that are already implied in the system.
Thank you. Anatoly?
I think just to summarize what we see here, the problem is not going to go away, and we're not going to start using social media or internet in general. So demonetizing certain type of content and looking at the targeted ads practices by different platforms and actors is important. So it will probably take care of some types of intimidation attacks, hate speech, coordinated efforts to interfere in countries' elections. So that's just one side. So that removes demonetization and monetary incentives. The other side that we talked about today is the politics and political polarization in general. So that perhaps have to be addressed in a different way, because we did see over the last 2 years or so how it's the state leaders, presidents, prime ministers who often propagate and initiate misinformation type of campaigns and conspiracy theories. So that's something cannot be solved by simply deplatforming Donald Trump from Twitter and other social media platforms. So we have to consider different aspects of it and jump into new novel approaches. There's a lot of conversations about how we can slow down the social media, because the first decade of the social media age was about how do you make a message spread as fast as possible, as efficiently as possible. Well, maybe this decade should be about how can we slow down that message and maybe prioritize that quality content that Tim is talking about.
Thank you. I guess I wonder to what degree we need to think about the ways that repetition and iteration inform a lot of how these things operate. So repeatedly clicking on similar things and then being pushed more similar things, but also the unfortunately well-worn grooves of racist and misogynist discourse that then get pushed into new channels in order to target disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And that repetition can look like it's tractable to algorithms, but it's so easy to game them. I'm thinking of the case that was brought to light a few months ago of an anti-vax group on Facebook that simply referred to the vaccines as dancing. So they talked about how they were opposed to dancing. And it was a very simple word switch that would not be visible, they thought, to the algorithms. And the other end, you got the problem of if you quote racist content in order to analyze it and unpack it, you end up being picked up by the same kinds of mechanisms. So how do we get away from the sort of economic model of looking for maximum repetitions for minimal oversight?
That's an excellent question, and there's so many different layers to it. So one thing you're pointing out is the ways in which what emerges online or seems to emerge online is actually the linking together of various groups that go along a certain rabbit hole. So people have very famously argued that the road to the alt-right is via health supplements. Right? And so what happens is you go to a health site, it says, eat kale. You like kale. You question, certain medical authorities sometimes. You believe in certain things. And then, one by one, you get taken to various sites. And what's so important is that what happens is that it's not simply that you're polarized to a certain group, but what's sought out is not, and not what's sought out isn't all your likes, but the most polarizing of your likes. The likes that make you different than others with others. And then ways to link those all together into a chain around a common enemy, or to shift people in a certain way. So there's ways in which what seems to be a natural progression is actually something that's carefully planned. The other question that you're bringing up in terms of dancing for another term, this is why literary criticism and social media analytics should come together, because a lot of what's being done through metonym, metonymy, figures of speech, et cetera, are really important and could be thought through together. And they're absolutely key to understanding this constant shifting in order to get away from certain targeting, but also to attract new followers. So we did a analysis of the sentiment of tweets following the January 6th insurrection, and they were viewed as mainly positive in sentiment because of the proud and proud boys. So there's a way in which the word use is being employed specifically with these tools in mind, but also following and drawing on questions of affect and sentiment. So I think what you're pointing to is a real need for interdisciplinary work that brings our expertise and our brokenness from our own methods in order to take on this dynamic landscape.
Great, thank you. Tim?
Yeah, I totally agree with Wendy, especially about that slippery slope, right? Being pulled into the vortex. We've done a lot of work around the phrase immune boosting, right? Which is increasingly code for doing that naturally instead of the vaccine, right? And I think that this issue speaks to some really practical challenges too. I totally agree with everything that Wendy just said, but there's also really practical nuts and bolts regulatory issues around this. I think we have to become more skilled and more nimble about how we regulate the use of this kind of phraseology, not just on the social media space, but also in the context of marketing. I hadn't heard that dancing story. I can't believe I missed that. And first of all, they put in dancing. Didn't they learn anything from Footloose? If you've learned anything from Footloose, that was you don't ban dancing, right? So, but that is a really good example. And we're seeing, these people that are spreading this information, as Wendy just highlighted, they're very nimble. They're nimble, right? They know how to switch out words in order to shape the public discourse. So many strategies are used. What we're seeing increasingly, and it drives me absolutely nuts, is the just asking question, the jacking off strategy, the Joe Rogan strategy. Again, a very effective strategy because it does, who's against just asking questions? Who's asking? I'm just asking if the vaccines work. That's all I'm doing. That's an incredibly effective strategy because it seems benign. It seems almost righteous, right? It almost seems righteous, but it can still inject, it's doubt mongering. And we know from history, doubt mongering, unfortunately, is a very effective strategy for not only just creating information chaos, but for causing great public health harm.
Yeah, I think it's called sea lioning, that you just keep asking disingenuous questions like, is there really proof that there's a virus? Is there really proof? And just keep piling them on and sowing doubt, as you point out. Anatoly?
Those are great examples why content moderation and filtering will not work if it just relies on content of the messages, because it's just so easy to bypass it. So as a result, many platforms switching to look at the behavior of accounts that engage in certain type of campaigns. So trying to detect coordinated efforts, the use of automated accounts, and so on. The challenge here from the research side that a lot of the signals that platforms are using to detect and flag some of this content, they are not available to researchers to examine independently. So the process of blocking an account is not very transparent at all. So as a result, we're close to the end of the panel, but I would advocate, and Wendy mentioned interdisciplinary approach to this type, to study this problem fully. Well, to study this, we need that piece of it, what platforms actually do and how do they detect and what they take down. There are some efforts that, for example, Twitter did put out those data sets. The one I presented today is because of those initiatives where they actually shared the accounts that they took down and shared the content that was removed. But in many cases, when we talk about hate speech, online harassments, those type of campaigns, they would, even if they disappear from their platforms, we as a researcher don't actually have access to the data because it's gone from the platform. So we cannot really understand who initiated it, how they propagated it, and so on.
Great, thank you. Interdisciplinary is a great way to end this really interdisciplinary session, and that we need to bring together the disciplines to think about how people are talking to each other, the histories that they're drawing on, as well as the economics of all of this and the technology, and how all of those things are creating this kind of toxic soup that is heightening very violent discourses in our communities. So with that, I'll thank my three panelists, and you've done a great job. Thank you so much for all that you brought to our attention today and for a really fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. And thank you, tech staff, for trying to get this working. Thanks.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you, everyone.